The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of golden dust and crimson rocks that burned beneath the sun. The wind carried with it the scent of sagebrush and the ghostly echo of hoofbeats, as if the land itself remembered every rider who had ever dared to cross it. And in these prairies, where legends grew taller than the mesas, one story towered above them all: the tale of the giant Apache woman. They called her Ishta. To some, she was a warrior. To others, a monster. But to all, she was untouchable. She stood taller than most men, her shoulders broad, her arms strong enough to wrestle a steer to the ground. Her eyes were dark and unyielding, like the cliffs of her homeland, and her voice carried the weight of thunder rolling across the plains. "No man is strong enough for me," she declared, and every word sank into the hearts of those who dared to challenge her. Ranchers, drifters, outlaws, men from across the frontier sought to test her, to prove themselves. None returned with pride. Some limped away with bruised bodies, others with broken spirits. A few never returned at all. Around campfires, cowboys told stories of her strength. They said she could lift a full-grown horse onto its hind legs with her bare hands. They whispered that bullets could not pierce her skin, that the spirits of her ancestors guarded her. Children of the Apache tribes grew up in her shadow, believing her to be more legend than flesh. Yet she was real, and she lived by her own law. Men feared her, women admired her, and the land itself seemed to bend to her will. She hunted when she wished, rode when she pleased, and trusted no one but herself. She was free, wild, and untamed, like the desert wind that carried her name from canyon to canyon. But legends have a way of drawing challengers. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky with fire, a whisper reached her ears. It spoke of a cowboy, not just another drifter with a pistol and a bottle of whiskey, but a man who rode alone, carrying a past as heavy as the saddle on his back. They said he had seen battles men twice his age couldn't endure. They said he had outdrawn killers in towns where law was just a word. They said he feared nothing. Ishta laughed when she heard the rumors. Another fool, she thought. Another man who would come, believing himself stronger, believing himself different. She had seen 100 like him. She had broken them all. But this cowboy was not like the others. He was not coming to test her strength. He was coming for something else entirely. And though she didn't know it yet, his shadow was already stretching across her horizon. The desert was about to witness a meeting that would be remembered for generations. The untamable woman and the cowboy who dared to ride in. The frontier had a way of shaping men. Some were broken by it, others hardened like steel, but very few walked away unchanged. The cowboy who rode alone across the western plains was one of those few. His name was whispered in saloons, carried by the clink of whiskey glasses and the hushed voices of drifters. No one quite knew his full story, but every town he left behind carried a fragment of it, like pieces of a puzzle too jagged to fit together. He was not the tallest man, nor the loudest. He did not boast, he did not laugh with the others at the bar. He carried himself with the silence of a man who had seen too much and learned that words were useless against bullets. His hat was worn and tilted low, his boots caked with dust, and his duster coat bore the scars of countless miles. A revolver hung at his hip, not polished like a gambler's toy, but used, its grip smoothed by years of calloused hands. They said he once rode with outlaws, but turned against them when their greed outweighed their honor. They said he'd faced down 3 gunfighters in a single morning, leaving the street silent and red. They said he had crossed the Rio Grande with nothing but his horse, his pistol, and a half-healed wound that would have killed most men. Yet despite all the tales, no one could point to a moment when he sought glory. He wasn't chasing fame, nor fortune. His battles weren't fought for gold or land. There was something else inside him, something no one could quite name. Some called it pride, others redemption. What drew him east, toward the canyons and the stories of the Apache woman, only he could know. But the truth was simple. He had heard her name whispered one night in a smoky saloon, carried on the lips of a prospector who spoke like he had seen the devil herself. "They say she's taller than 2 men stacked," the prospector muttered, his hands trembling around his glass. "Stronger than any bull, and colder than winter steel. Men go to her, thinking they'll tame her, and none return the same. If they return at all." The cowboy didn't laugh like the others. He didn't spit tobacco and call it nonsense. He sat in silence, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat, the flickering lamplight catching the faintest smirk at the corner of his mouth. For him, it wasn't the strength of the woman that drew his interest, it was the defiance in her words. "No man is strong enough for me." He'd heard challenges before. He'd seen pride in the eyes of men who thought themselves untouchable. But rarely had he heard it in a woman's voice, carried across deserts and mountains, repeated like a curse. The road to her land was unforgiving. Days bled into nights, the horizon stretching endlessly, broken only by the jagged teeth of mesas and the shadow of circling hawks. Heat shimmered off the sand, making mirages dance like ghosts. His horse, a chestnut with a white blaze, carried him without complaint, as if it too knew the journey had meaning. Along the way, the cowboy remembered faces long buried in the dust of his past. A woman once, back in a town whose name he had forgotten, had told him he was chasing storms. A partner years ago had said he had no business playing the hero. Both were right in their own way. Yet here he was, riding toward a storm unlike any he had ever faced. It was not a storm of bullets, nor the law. It was a storm in human form, a giant woman who lived beyond the reach of civilization, untamed, unbroken. At night, under a blanket of stars, he thought about her. Not in the way other men did, not with lust nor conquest. He thought about the challenge she represented, the raw test of spirit. Could anyone stand before her without faltering? Could anyone match the fire in her eyes without being consumed? As the days dragged on, his path crossed with others who had heard of her. A trader in a dusty wagon warned him to turn back. A group of cowhands laughed and wagered how long he'd last before he crawled away beaten. But none of their words deterred him. The truth was, he wasn't riding east to tame her. He was riding to see if she was real. Because if she was, then perhaps the frontier still had legends worth believing in. And if she wasn't, well, then she was just another story, and he would keep riding until the land swallowed him whole. Finally, as the canyon walls began to rise around him, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, he felt it. The weight of the land shifted, as though it belonged to someone else now. The air itself seemed to hum, alive with the presence of something greater. His horse tossed its head, uneasy, as if sensing what lay ahead. The cowboy lifted his gaze. In the distance, standing at the mouth of the canyon, was a silhouette. Broad shoulders, a stance as solid as the stone cliffs behind her, and arms, bare and strong, glinting in the fading light. She was real, and she was waiting. The cowboy's hand brushed against the grip of his revolver, not in threat, but in instinct. His other hand tightened on the reins. Slowly, he urged his horse forward, toward the shadow that would change his story forever. The canyon swallowed sound. Every hoofbeat, every gust of wind seemed to vanish into the towering red walls that rose like ancient guardians on either side. The cowboy's horse slowed, ears twitching nervously, hooves scuffing against the dry earth. Ahead, in the heart of the canyon, she stood. The giant Apache woman. The stories had not exaggerated. She was immense, her frame casting a shadow even in the high midday sun. Her sleeveless light shirt clung to her shoulders and chest, showing arms cut from stone, veins running like rivers beneath her bronze skin. Her braids swayed with the wind, and a feather tied at the end of one caught the sunlight. She stood with her legs braced apart, as though the canyon itself was her throne. The cowboy reined in his horse, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of uncertainty. She was no rumor, no tale around a saloon fire. She was real, flesh and blood, and yet somehow more than human. "You came," she said, her voice carrying like thunder rolling through the canyon. The cowboy tipped his hat forward, his voice low but steady. "Heard tell there was someone here who thought no man could stand before her. Figured I'd see for myself." A smirk tugged at her lips. She took a step forward, and the earth seemed to tremble. "And what do you hope to find? Glory? To tame me like all the others?" The cowboy swung down from his saddle, boots hitting the earth with a crunch. He stood tall, though even standing straight, he barely reached her shoulders. His hand hovered near his revolver out of habit, but there was no threat in his stance. He met her gaze evenly, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the same fire that burned in hers. "I'm not here to tame you," he said. "I'm here to see if the stories are true." That caught her off guard. She narrowed her eyes, studying him as though trying to peel away his skin and read the bones beneath. "The stories say many things. That I cannot be beaten. That no man can make me bow. That I live without fear. Which one did you come chasing?" He shrugged lightly. "All of them. Or none. Doesn't matter. I don't believe in stories. I believe in what I see." The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy as the desert heat. The canyon seemed to hold its breath. Then she laughed. A deep, rich sound that echoed off the walls like a storm breaking. "You've got a bold tongue for a man so small." She flexed one arm, her bicep rising like a coiled boulder beneath her skin, every muscle taut with power. "Do you see now? Do you understand why men fear me? The cowboy didn't flinch. His eyes traveled up her frame, taking in the sheer strength before him, and then returned to her face. I see a woman who's fought too long to need anyone. A woman who thinks strength is all there is. Her laughter died, and her eyes hardened. She stepped closer, so close that her shadow fell over him. He had to tilt his head back to meet her gaze. Strength is survival. Without it, you die. Tell me, cowboy, what else is there? For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he slowly unbuckled his holster and set it on the ground, the revolver glinting in the sunlight. He raised his empty hands, palms open. There's more than guns. More than fists. Sometimes strength is standing your ground without drawing. Her eyes narrowed again, this time not with anger, but with something else, curiosity. Few men had dared to face her without the promise of violence. Fewer still had spoken to her as an equal. You're different, she said at last. Or maybe, he replied softly, you just ain't met a man who didn't try to conquer you. Another silence fell, but this one was different. The air shifted, tension giving way to something unspoken. She studied him, her expression unreadable, and for the first time, she didn't look down on him as prey. But the canyon was not without ears. From the cliffs above, shadows moved, men watching, waiting. Outlaws who had followed the cowboy's trail, hoping to profit from his journey. Neither he nor the giant woman noticed them yet, but soon they would. For now it was just the two of them, locked in a standoff that was not of guns, but of spirit. The meeting had begun, and neither of their lives would ever be the same. The canyon had fallen into silence after their words, but silence in the frontier rarely lasted long. Hidden in the ridges above them, men crouched in the shadows, rifles glinting faintly as they tracked their prey. Outlaws, not the kind who rode for honor, but the scavengers of the West, the kind who lived on ambush and fear. The cowboy had known he was followed. He had felt it in the weight of the air behind him, in the way his horse had tossed its head restlessly. But standing face to face with the giant woman, he had almost forgotten. Almost. It was she who noticed first. Her head turned suddenly, sharp as a hawk's, eyes narrowing at the movement on the cliffs. She didn't speak. She simply moved, stepping forward, her massive frame shielding the cowboy as a rifle cracked and the bullet whined off the rock beside them. The cowboy's hand darted instinctively for his revolver, snatching it from the dust where he had set it down. The woman's voice thundered in the canyon. They come for blood. And then the canyon erupted. Figures rose from the cliffs, outlaws with bandanas pulled over their faces, guns spitting fire into the sunlit air. Dust exploded from the rocks, horses screamed in the distance, and the narrow gorge became a killing ground. The cowboy dropped to one knee, firing quickly, his shots clean and measured. One outlaw fell, then another, tumbling from the rocks above. But there were too many, and they were spread wide across the ridges. This was not a fight he could win with bullets alone. Then came the sound that silenced even the outlaws, the roar of the giant woman. She leapt forward, scaling the rock face with her bare hands, as though it were nothing more than a ladder. Muscles rippled across her arms and back as she pulled herself upward, bullets sparking harmlessly against the stone near her. With one sweep of her arm, she caught a rifleman and hurled him into the dust below, his scream echoing before he landed with a thud. The cowboy's eyes narrowed. For all the stories he had heard, seeing her in motion was something else entirely. She wasn't just strong. She was fury, wild and untamed, a storm in human form. Yet even in the chaos, he noticed something. Her strength, though overwhelming, was also reckless. She charged headlong, exposing herself to danger, trusting her size to protect her. Against a few men, it might have worked. Against a dozen with rifles, it was madness. "Cover your flank," the cowboy shouted, his voice cutting through the gunfire. He sprinted up the rocks, firing to drive the outlaws back, positioning himself to guard her exposed side. She glanced down at him, momentarily surprised, then gave the faintest nod before tearing another gunman from his perch. The battle raged. The canyon became a storm of dust, stone, and gunfire. The woman fought with fists and raw power, tossing men like rag dolls, her sleeveless arms slick with sweat, veins standing out as she swung. The cowboy moved like a shadow at her side, every bullet he fired striking with purpose, each shot keeping her path clear. For the first time, they fought not against each other, but together. Minutes felt like hours, but slowly the tide turned. The outlaws, once certain of their ambush, faltered. They had expected an easy kill, a lone cowboy. They had not expected her. They had not expected the two of them, back to back, unyielding. When the last of them broke and fled into the desert, silence fell once more. The canyon walls echoed only with the fading cries of the defeated. The air reeked of gunpowder and dust. The woman stood tall, chest heaving, arms trembling slightly from the exertion. The cowboy holstered his revolver, his breath steady but his eyes sharp. He studied her as she wiped the sweat from her brow, her muscles gleaming in the sunlight. "You fight like no man I've ever seen," he said quietly. She turned to him, her gaze still burning with the fire of battle. "And you fight with more than bullets. You see what others cannot." For a moment, there was something unspoken between them. Not gratitude, she was too proud for that. Not awe, he was too steady for that. It was something else. A recognition. A realization that together, they had been stronger than either alone. The cowboy looked toward the horizon, where the outlaws had vanished. "They'll be back," he said. "Men like that don't give up easy." She crossed her arms, the muscles in her shoulders flexing. "Then let them come. They will find only ruin here." But in her voice, beneath the thunder, there was a flicker of something she could not hide. For the first time, she had fought not as a lone legend, but beside someone who did not fear her. And for the first time, she wondered if her words, "No man is strong enough for me," were truly as unshakable as she believed. The canyon had witnessed a battle, but the true struggle was only beginning. The desert has a way of holding on to echoes. Long after the gunfire faded, long after the last outlaw's boots disappeared into the horizon, the canyon still hummed with the memory of battle. The air was heavy with dust, and in that dust lingered the weight of something greater than bullets or blood. The cowboy and the giant woman stood in silence at the canyon's mouth. The sun dipped lower, spilling molten gold across the stone walls and turning their shadows into giants of their own. He adjusted the brim of his hat, steady as ever. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand, muscles taut, chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a warrior's breath. For the first time, she did not look like a legend carved from stone. She looked human, sweat on her brow, dirt streaked across her arms, strands of hair sticking to her cheek. Yet that humanity made her seem no smaller. If anything, it made her greater. "You fought well," she said at last, her voice quieter than the thunder she had carried before. The cowboy glanced at her, his gray eyes steady. "So did you. But I reckon you knew that already." A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips, though it didn't last. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the sun bled into the desert sky. "All my life, men have come to me with the same fire. To prove themselves. To take what cannot be taken. And I broke them. Every one. I thought that was strength. To stand alone. To need no one." She flexed her arm unconsciously, the muscles standing out in the fading light, as though testing the truth of her own words. "But today I stood with you. And for the first time, I did not fight alone." The cowboy said nothing. Words were not his weapon. But he stepped closer, close enough that their shadows merged in the canyon dust. He did not reach for her, did not try to claim what was not his. He simply stood beside her, as if his presence alone was proof enough. "You confuse me, cowboy," she admitted, her tone sharper again. "You do not fear me. You do not try to tame me. You fight with me, not against me. Tell me why." He looked at her then, truly looked, not at the muscles that made her feared, nor the legend that had spread her name across the frontier, but at the woman who had carried that burden alone. His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice that carried further than a shout. Because strength ain't just muscle, ain't just fists or guns. Strength is standing when the world wants you broken. Strength is fighting when you'd rather lay down. And strength is knowing when you don't have to stand alone anymore. Her breath caught, so slight it might have gone unnoticed. For a heartbeat, the woman who had declared no man is strong enough for me faltered. Not because she had been beaten, but because for the first time, someone had seen past her strength and spoken to the fire inside her. The silence stretched, but it was no longer heavy. It was alive. The canyon walls glowed with the last of the sun, and the air felt charged with something new. She turned back to him, and this time her eyes no longer burned with challenge. They burned with respect. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "I was wrong." The cowboy tipped his hat, a wry half-smile touching his lips. Wouldn't be the first time a legend turned out different than the story. For the first time she laughed, not the mocking thunder of before, but something lighter, freer. It rolled through the canyon and echoed like a promise. The two of them walked together toward the horizon, their silhouettes stretching long across the desert floor. Behind them, the canyon held the memory of their meeting, etched into its walls like the birth of a new legend. And in the towns and saloons, around campfires and across the plains, the story began to spread. not of a woman who could not be tamed, nor of a cowboy who came to conquer her, but of two souls who met in the heart of the desert, where strength was tested not in battle alone, but in spirit. The legend of the giant Apache woman and the lone cowboy had begun. And like all legends, it would outlive them both.